Geist des Herrn ist da, ist Freiheit, Freiheit. Und wo die Kraft des Höchsten nicht ist, Freude, Freude. Dein Wind weht manchmal leise, manchmal laut. Doch lass dein Feuer fallen auf deine Haut. Heiliger Geist, leite die Zeit, zeig uns den Weg für uns und drum. Geist Gottes, komm, wir brauchen mehr von dir. Heiliger Geist, leite die Zeit, zeig uns den Weg für uns und drum. Geist Gottes, komm, wir brauchen mehr von dir. Hier mehr von dir. Die immer wieder Leben schafft, Unmögliches möglich macht, lebt in mir. Deine Auferstehungskraft, die immer wieder Leben schafft, Unmögliches möglich macht, lebt in mir. Deine Auferstehungskraft, die immer wieder Leben schafft, Unmögliches möglich macht, lebt in mir. Oh, deine Auferstehungskraft, die immer wieder Leben schafft, Unmögliches möglich macht, lebt in mir. Heiliger Geist, leite die Zeit, zeig uns den Weg für uns und Thron. Geist Gottes, komm, wir brauchen mehr von dir. Heiliger Geist, leite die Zeit, zeig uns den Weg für uns und Thron. Geist Gottes, komm, wir brauchen mehr von dir. Hier mehr von dir. Hier, wir brauchen 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 mehr von dir. Hier.
Hallo, ihr Lieben. Herzlich willkommen zum Gottesdienst. Ich freue mich, dass wir heute gemeinsam Gottesdienst feiern können. Im Namen des Vaters, des Sohnes und des Heiligen Geistes. Ich freue mich, dass wir auf diese Art und Weise Gemeinschaft erleben können und dass wir auf diese Art und Weise trotz der Umstände zusammen sein können. Ich hoffe, ihr habt diese Woche ein bisschen das Wetter genossen und ein paar Sonnenstrahlen abbekommen. Und ja, ich hoffe, es geht euch gut und freue mich sehr auf die gemeinsame Zeit, die wir jetzt miteinander haben. Patrick, Will und Emily werden heute gemeinsam predigen und es geht um das Thema Leben im Geist und den Text in Hesekiel 37, die Verse 1 bis 6. Und die haben mich gebeten, den Text vorzulesen und deswegen mache ich das jetzt. Ein Tal voller Totengebeine. Einmal wurde ich vom Herrn ergriffen und hatte eine Vision. Darin hob mich Gottes Geist empor und brachte mich in ein weites Tal, das mit Totengebeinen übersät war. Dann führte er mich durch die ganze Ebene und ich sah dort unzählige Knochen verstreut liegen. Sie waren völlig vertrocknet. Gott fragte mich: Du Mensch, können diese Gebeine je wieder lebendig werden? Ich antwortete: Herr, mein Gott, das weißt du allein. Da sagte er zu mir: Sprich zu diesen dürren Knochen und fordere sie auf. Hört, was der Herr euch sagt. Ich bringe Geist in euch zurück und mache euch wieder lebendig. Ja, das verspreche ich, Gott, der Herr. Ich lasse Sehnen und Fleisch um euch wachsen und überziehe euch mit Haut. Meinen Atem hauche ich euch ein, damit ihr wieder lebendig werdet. Daran sollt ihr erkennen, dass ich der Herr bin.
Alright. Hallo, guten Morgen, guten Abend. Hoffentlich alles geht gut bei euch, ihr schönen Menschen. Welcome to another good old American conversation. So we have me, Will, Emily, and Patrick talking today about a passage in Ezekiel about the dry bones coming back to life. This is very much, it's not going to be a typical sermon. It might not even be a typical Gespräch, Gottesdienst. This is very much just us thinking and talking through this passage together and seeing how this moment of Ezekiel is living through relates to life in the spirit and what this can say to us in our context today. So we're glad that you're here along with us for the ride and being a part of the discussion with us today. I'm going to read our passage for us again in English. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So Emily and I are in seminary right now. So clearly we have all of the answers to everything. But Emily's actually finishing up her first semester on, or her semester on studying the Old Testament. And so Emily, can you give us a little bit of context of where is this passage placed within the biblical narrative and kind of what Ezekiel is talking about a bit?
Yeah, this context is really interesting. And I think what I love being in seminary and studying the Bible is context really helps in understanding, giving weightiness, I think, to the passage, of adding that extra depth of what we're actually dealing with. And so, yeah, Ezekiel is a prophet. He's a contemporary of Jeremiah, and he is living in exile in Babylon. So this is part of this exilic period in the history of Israel. So they're hopeless and homeless, pretty much, living in this culture that's not their own, separated from their land of promise, right? They're away from everything they've ever known. And to be a prophet in this time, kind of prophesying to a hopeless, exiled people, I think it gives really interesting perspective, and the just the words that are being written during this time are really interesting. And if you read it through this lens of God speaking to a prophet that then needs to kind of then speak to his people during this time, it kind of, this metaphor you can see how a metaphor of God talking to Ezekiel can then be seen as Ezekiel talking to the people of, can these bones live, right? Can Israel kind of live once again? I think is really quite powerful. And so within this topic of life in the spirit, right? So life and very often equates to breath, right? This idea of what gives us life. Well, it's the breath that comes into our lungs and kind of gives us life. And this word breath obviously is a kind of this theme that kind of pops up over and over again throughout these verses, right? The breath that enters these dry bones so that they can live. And the word breath that's being used here, it's called ruach, which, and interesting thing about Hebrew is that these words kind of have dual meanings and then even add more depth to it. So ruach in this case means breath, like I talked about, but it also means wind. And so it kind of emotes the sense of energy, right? So if you look at the wind, right, the wind is invisible, but you see its power when it moves through something. So you only see how powerful wind can be in its reaction towards something else. So in this passage, right, the breath, the ruach that's entering through these bodies is only seen in how they react towards the ruach over, like, and how the ruach is entering the bodies and the bodies are being brought to life. And so that kind of all intertwining together kind of shows the power that's kind of being emoting from these words and from this passage.
Yeah, and we're talking about this passage this week. It might seem a bit odd, but we're in this Easter season, is what we call it in the very liturgical church, which Totengebeine is not a super liturgical, but this period between Easter and looking ahead towards Pentecost that is coming ahead. And this passage also came to us in the pastoral team group as the vaccine rollout begins to pick up here in Austria, as we look in a few weeks of finally coming out of lockdown, as spring is just bursting in all around us. There's a new energy, there's a new wind that we have. And so we feel a new breath that is coming in. But are we really getting back to normal? And do we need to get back to normal? And how in this in-between time between Easter and Pentecost, but also the in-between time of the life of Christ, as we talked about a few weeks ago, of living in the middle of darkness and light, and living in a kingdom of God that is not fully realized yet, that is here but not yet. How do we live in this in-between time? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first, we're just going to pull out a few other things from the passage before we move into talking about where does this fit into this whole context. So Patrick, talk about some of the things that stuck out to you in this passage, reading it this week.
Yeah, so the thing that kind of really stuck out to me was sort of this back and forth between God and Ezekiel, where after God shows Ezekiel the valley of the dry bones, he asks them sort of this rhetorical, almost sort of testing question of like, all right, do you think these dry bones could do something, could move, could walk? And instead of saying yes or no, Ezekiel sort of goes for what we might think of the stereotypical Bible school answer of, well, you know God, you know everything, which might think initially is sort of a bit of a cop-out, but sort of in the context of where not just he, but the Israelites just in general are right now, of they don't have really anything to stand on, and so it's okay, I don't know, but I know that you know, so I'm just going to do what you say. And so then God follows that up with saying, all right, then prophesy to the bones. And might think like, okay, that seems really weird. All right, yeah, okay, it's a vision, and you're just supposed to kind of go with it. But if you really think about it, are prophesying to a sick person, okay, prophesying to the Gentiles, all right, that makes sense, but to bones that have long since been dead and are just laying on the ground doesn't really make sense and seems really unorthodox. And so to me, sort of this back and forth almost says like, all right now, we are in the midst of our own sort of exile, whether that be social distance, emotional distance, spiritual distance. We are removed from our normalcy, and in this sense, like Ezekiel, it's we don't know, but we know that God knows, and some of the things that going forward we might need to do, or God asks us to do, might seem unorthodox or maybe verging on the absurd, but it's really kind of sticking to that that core of we don't know, but God does.
Yeah, I think there's a level of trust that goes into, I think, just in order to be a prophet and to be a follower of Christ, there is a deep level of trust that has to go into this, because there is so much unknown and also kind of unpredictability when it comes to God, of what is God going to ask me to do or to say next. And I think that very much relates to, if we look ahead towards, I also think it's important to say that, we are diving into the story, but we're not the original people. We are not the Israelites, and I think there's wisdom that we can glean from this story. But what we're saying in our conversation today is that we are not the promised land people, and that we are not exactly. It's not a one-to-one, but there's still wisdom that we can find from this. But I do think that it relates a lot to kind of into the disciples, into the beginning of this disorientation of Christ dying and coming back, and then the Spirit coming, and kind of this new thing happening. There's a level of trust that has to be present there in order to be there. Yeah, so Patrick, you're talking about we're in this dry bones period, and for some of us, it might feel like we're starting to come out of that, right? As I said, vaccine rollout is starting to pick up. Things are starting to feel like they're almost normal again. But I think an important thing, and something that I think was said a lot this time last year, of, oh, well, we just want to rush and get back to what's normal. And whether or not normal is a good thing to get back to or not, I hope and pray that we recognize that just because it's getting better for some people, that it's not getting better for a lot of people. And that if anything, the pandemic has just peeled back so many covers and curtains and rugs to reveal all of this just kind of inequality and injustice in the world. And then as different countries and different people groups are able to emerge out of this uncomfortable period, or this time of really, really dry bones, quicker than others, we see how unequal this is. Yeah, Emily, do you have any thoughts on responding at all to any of that?
Yeah, I loved what both of y'all said. That was really great. I think, with Patrick, I was just really struck by that verse that goes, "Mortal, can these bones live?" Because it's almost kind of like this hypothetical, weird, cheeky question, because God obviously knows the answer. And Ezekiel's response is kind of one of like hopelessness. Like, I don't know, but you know. And not in a sense of like, I think you can interpret it different ways. Like, you can interpret it of like, God knows everything, but I interpret it more as I know nothing. And I think you can kind of interpret it both ways. And I guess depending on where you're at in life. But right now I'm definitely interpreting it as, I don't know, like, I don't know. And so that's one thing I thought was really interesting. It kind of comes from this, Ezekiel, do you have hope? Do you trust me? And kind of this response of, I don't know. But then God responds not in a like cajoling, like, react, like negative reaction way, but kind of responds in this just like this presence of life, like life-giving power, which I think is quite beautiful. And yeah, I mean, Will and I talked a lot about this idea of the pandemic of like, what does life look like after? And there's been so much talk about like, when life gets back to normal, we can do this. And while like so many of us want life to get back to the way it was, I think there's just questions of like, why? Like, life wasn't like, should it not be a time of questioning what can we do to kind of breathe new life into dry bones versus breathing old life? I think that kind of becomes that question of, can these dry bones give new perspective, and can these dry bones give new perspective into what kind of life do we want to live once the life is given to us? Because Will and I kind of talked about like, life is being given into bones, but not to all the bones. And so there are these living, tendons of people who are walking around, but they're walking over these other dry bones that have not been breathed into yet. And what can we do to kind of make sure that all dry bones are given a chance to kind of live and breathe and walk again? Like, what are we doing to give new life and like new perspective into what that looks like? And then lastly, Will kind of talked about like, yeah, this passage isn't written to us, but what I love about kind of understanding the Bible more and more is that it's not really about how do I see myself in the text more, it's more about how do I see God? Like who when we talk about God, what are we talking about? Like, who is this character of God that we keep referring to? And I think the more stories we read and the more that we kind of reap from these narratives, the better understanding we have of who this character of God is and what kind of characteristics embody this character of God. And one of these characteristics is hope. Like, to a hopeless people, kind of life-giving, breathy hope is given. And that's the kind of character that God is. And that kind of character is what we believe in, what we have faith in, that kind of sustains us through this period of time. So there's so many different things that we're kind of reaping from this passage that it's almost like, where does it leave us? Because the story just ends there. Like, if you continue on the story, it's just kind of like, well, they're walking around and you're like, well, what do we do with this? And I think that's kind of where we pick it up and we go, the life is given to us, and what do we kind of do with it now? And I think that's where a lot of us are kind of at.
Yeah, I think this dual, as I mentioned earlier, of living in hope that something can still go on even if we are surrounded by dry bones. I was on a call with my lovely Lebanese Baptist friends this past week. I love them. I talk about them all of the time. But someone had asked the leader who is of the seminary there in Beirut, do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? And in Lebanon, things are considerably worse than they here are in Austria and really in a lot of other places. And so Eli, he answered very realistically, no, we cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's the reality of so many people in the world, is that some of us might be able to see a light at the end of the tunnel, but the reality is that for many, many in the world, it's just a valley of dry bones. They cannot see the life coming and the light at the end of the tunnel. But what he said, but what I can see is a lot of lights inside of the tunnel, little lights that can lead us onward. And Emily, I love what you're talking about, this idea of we have this breath and we can choose what to do with it. And I think this relates back, looking towards Pentecost as well, Holy Spirit coming onto us. And then what do we do with that gift, this new breath, this new life? And for those of us that are experiencing a new wind at this time, what do we do with that? Do we just go back to our normal lives, or what, how do we act on that? Patrick, do you have any thoughts on any of that before we close up our discussion today?
Yeah, to kind of echo your thoughts of you coming towards the end of the pandemic and how it might seem like we might not see the end or know exactly where it is. Something that had kind of occurred to me while we were reading this is the Israelites are almost sort of in the same shoes in that if you read through the whole Testament, the conquering or exile or imprisonment of the Israelites isn't just something that happened once, but is a sort of semi-recurring theme. And similar to them, this isn't the first pandemic that the human race has experienced, especially not even in recent memory. I was talking earlier this week with some people thinking back in just 50, 60 years ago was polio, and roughly about a century ago was the Spanish flu, and how these things have happened before, but while it might not be in our living memory, we can still kind of look back to those things and say, like, okay, yes, right now what's going on with us isn't the greatest, but we've come through this before. There is a light, at the end of the tunnel. We might be able to see it right now, but there will be a day where we will be able to refer to Corona entirely in the past tense. Just like with the Israelites before, there were times where they had gone through all these calamities, but at the same time, all right, God was able to pull them through also. And I feel like there's a really strong sort of connection that we can kind of really grasp onto there as well.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to close us with kind of a prayer / blessing for what we've talked about today. God, we trust that life in the spirits, life in your spirits, will be one that is filled with your breath. God, we trust that your spirit will fill us and sustain us in order to live in these weird in-between times. And God, we have faith in your ability to take the dry bones of our world, the sickness, the injustice, the inequalities, the sadness, the pain, and the darkness, that you can take that and breathe newness into it. God, as you breathe new life into us, may we be good stewards of that life, of that energy, of that wind, and give us the strength to live in these in-between times. Amen. My soul cries out, my soul cries out for you. These bones cry out, these dry bones cry for you to live and move, 'cause only you can raise the dead, could lift my head up. My soul cries out, my soul cries out for you. Jesus, you're the one who saves us, constantly creates us into something new. Jesus, surely you will find us, surely our Messiah will make all things new, will make all things new. My soul cries out,
These bones cry out, these dry bones cry for you to live and move, 'cause only you can raise the dead, can lift my head up. Jesus, you're the one who saves us, constantly creates us into something new. Jesus, surely you will find us, surely our Messiah will make all things new, will make all things new.
Life is breaking out, it's breaking out, it's breaking out. Life is breaking out, it's breaking out, it's breaking out. And love is breaking out, it's breaking out, it's breaking out. Jesus, you're the one who saves us, constantly creates us into something new. Jesus, surely you will find us, surely our Messiah will make all things new, will make all things My soul cries out, my soul cries out for you.
Für mich ist das ein sehr schwieriger Text. Aber etwas, das ich daraus gezogen habe, ist, dass die Begegnung mit Gott einen Unterschied machen kann. Und zwar den Unterschied machen kann von einem Tal voller Totengebeine hin zu blühendem Leben. Und deswegen habe ich mir gedacht, das, was ich mir eigentlich wünschen würde, wäre eine Begegnung mit Gott und habe deswegen ein kleines Wunschgebet mitgebracht. Ich wünsche dir eine Begegnung mit Gott. Eine Begegnung, die Kraft schenkt. Eine Begegnung, die Hoffnung ausstrahlt. Eine Begegnung, die den Schmerz vergessen lässt. Ich wünsche dir eine Begegnung mit Gott, wie immer dieser auch aussehen mag, wo immer du ihn auch entdeckst, was immer das auch für dich bedeutet. Ich wünsche dir eine Begegnung mit Gott, vielleicht in Form eines Gesprächs, vielleicht in Form eines Lachens, vielleicht in Form der Natur. Ich wünsche dir eine Begegnung mit Gott. Womöglich ist es ein Sternenhimmel oder ein Kinderlachen oder der Wind in deinem Haar. Ich wünsche dir eine Begegnung mit Gott. Ein kurzes Aufblitzen des Göttlichen, ein Funken Hoffnung, ein Hauch von Liebe. Ich wünsche dir eine Begegnung mit Gott. Ja, schön, dass wir zusammen Gottesdienst feiern können. Und ich freue mich, dass ich euch jetzt noch segnen und damit in die kommende Woche verabschieden darf. Und ich habe mir dafür ausgesucht den Psalm 23, die Verse 1 bis 2, weil ich finde, dass gerade in Zeiten wie diesen ist das ein wunderschöner Segensspruch. Der Herr ist mein Hirte, mir wird nichts mangeln. Er weidet mich auf einer grünen Aue und führet mich zum frischen Wasser. Amen. Ich wünsche euch eine gute Woche. Baba!